Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm so glad to see you all with us to hear about Informed or Overwhelmed, our recently published report on the impact of online news on children's wellbeing, and for our panel discussion a bit later. For those of you who don't know us, Internet Matters is a non-profit organisation, and we were set up predominantly to support parents and carers in the task of helping keep children safe online. Our webinar comes today in a week that's kicked off with crisis at the BBC News Division and claims of misrepresentation sparking debate about trust in the news, so a very kind of opportune time to have this discussion. We embarked on this project because engaging with the news is how we make sense of the world around us, and for young people it plays a vital role in developing their critical thinking skills. In the digital world, young people are finding more of their news online and on social media, yet the nature of algorithmic design, the rise of AI, and the ability for any user to post and share news content, whether it's verified or not, should give us cause for concern. As you'll hear today, there are risks with regard to the type of content children are exposed to, its ability to shape their opinion and blur the lines between fact and fiction. So we welcome all of you to this discussion today. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. The session is being recorded and will be published on YouTube, for which we'll share the link afterwards. Attendees won't be part of the recording, just so you know. Internet Matters, our research programme, includes our Pulse survey and our Digital Wellbeing Index, through which we regularly hear from parents and young people themselves about issues of online safety and their media literacy. Informed or Overwhelmed is actually a bespoke piece of research, and we were lucky enough to be supported by FT Strategies in pulling this together. So they're the specialist consultancy from the Financial Times. The research was conducted by our internal team, drawing together survey data and qualitative research with young people. We really set out to understand how children consume and are exposed to online news, the different forms this takes, but most specifically, what impact it has on their wellbeing. Today, we'll begin with a presentation of the findings from our Head of Policy and Research, Katie Freeman-Tayler. We'll then hear reflections from our panel, who are Nicky Cox, MBE, who's founder and CEO of Children United and Editor-in-Chief at First News, Louise Marriage, Principal for Online Safety at Ofcom, and Azzurra, Policy Lead at FullFact. We'll end with a panel discussion, including some questions from the audience. So you'll have the opportunity to ask questions via the Q&A box, if you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. So please do post them as we go through and hear more about the research and the findings, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the session. So I'll now pass over to Katie to talk through our research and findings.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really nice to have so many of you on the call. So as Rachel said, I will be taking you through the findings from our recent report, Informed or Overwhelmed. I've only got time to go through some of the headline findings today, so if you are interested in this topic or want to understand more or some of the nuances, please do go to our website where you'll be able to find a link to this report, and I'm also sure that someone in my team will drop a link to the report into the chat as well. So as Rachel said, this was based on both quant and qual research, so we did a nationally representative survey with 1,000 UK children aged 11 to 17, and then we also conducted focus groups and workshops with children and young people aged 13 to 17, which took place through July to September. A quick sort of explanation about the definition of news. It's not an easy thing to define, and we took quite a expansive understanding of our definition. So we meant both kind of current affairs type news, but also pop culture, celebrity, sports news. And news from us was not just from sort of established or traditional news outlets like the BBC or ITV. It could be news from content creators, for example, as well. So what did we find in the research? Well, children and young people are regularly consuming news. In fact, in our research, we found that 3/4 are engaging with news content at least once a week. There are, of course, nuances to this. So, for example, older children, 15 to 17-year-olds, they were engaging with news content more frequently than younger children. So they were twice as likely as 11 to 12-year-olds, for example, to engage with news content daily. And then in terms of where children and young people are getting their news from, we found that for most children and young people, their main source of news was online, and in particular, it was social media. So we found that 68% of children and young people in our research are getting their news from social media. Again, there were a few nuances to this. So while social media remained sort of high across all age groups, we did find younger children, so that sort of 11 to 13-year-old age group, they were a little bit more likely to get their news from teachers and schools, and equally older children were much more likely to get it from social media. And then on social media, in terms of where people are getting their news from, or children and young people are getting their news from, we found that they're getting it from a range of accounts and sources on social media platforms. So traditional news outlets, influencers and content creators, and friends and family, children and young people were getting their news content from those accounts at similar rates. So around 40% of children and young people got it from each of those accounts. However, where we see quite a difference is in relation to kind of trust in these accounts. So what you'll see here is that children and young people have significantly more trust in news accounts or traditional news accounts than they do in influencers and content creators. So we found that 55% of children and young people said that they trusted traditional news outlets or established news outlets like the BBC, ITV, Sky News, their accounts on social media, compared to only 16% of children and young people saying that they trusted influencers and content creators' accounts the most. And I think what's really interesting for us in relation to this, or a question that sort of was posed for me, was why are children and young people getting their news from influencers and content creators at the same rate as established news outlets, given there's so much difference in trust between these accounts on social media? And I think this really comes down to platforms and algorithms. So we found that for many children and young people, platform design had a significant influence on who they were getting news from on social media and the accounts that they were receiving it from. A lot of children and young people said they didn't necessarily follow any news-focused accounts, or they weren't looking out for news. It simply just appeared in their feeds, and that was sort of dictated by the algorithm and what other people were seeing. And so that's a little bit about kind of the social media news environment and who and where children and young people are getting their news from. But we also wanted to understand, what the impact of this news environment is for children and young people. And we found in our quantitative research that the vast majority of children, 61% of children, just click on there, 61% of children and young people who consume news on social media regularly have come across a news story that has worried or upset them. And of that 61%, 39% said that a news story that they'd come across in the past month had caused them extreme, or had made them very worried or extremely worried and upset. When we asked children and young people what sort of content was causing that upset or worry, we found that the most common content to cause them distress was content relating to war and conflict, violence and crime, and crisis events. And some examples that were given to us by children and young people were the Air India plane crash, the war in Israel and Gaza, and then also events like the murder of Charlie Kirk, which happened in the kind of later part of our research. And then unsurprisingly, given how news content works and also how social media and algorithms work, we found that often the content that caused the most upset or distress for children and young people was also the most common content that they came across in their feeds. So, for example, we can see here that when we asked children what was the most common news content that they saw, war and conflict was the highest at 59%. We did see some differences between children of different ages. So children aged 11 to 14, they came across war and conflict content and violence and crime content at lower rates than children aged 15 to 17 years old. And I think this is really positive, as one of the goals of the Online Safety Act is to reduce children's exposure to harmful content and to give them access to age-appropriate content. So this nuance in ages could suggest that that is what is happening here. However, it's also important to note that 11 to 12-year-olds, they probably shouldn't be encountering this content at all, given most social media platforms are prohibited, or in their terms of service outline that it's just for children aged 13 plus. So they shouldn't be on those platforms and seeing that content to begin with. We also found that the algorithmic design of social media contributes to this worry and upset. So children and young people, they're always ever articulate when it comes to research, and they were able to really explain how often they might come across a news story, for example, that they hadn't sought out. It just sort of appeared in their feed, and they might not be expecting to see it in that moment, and as a result, that what's caused them sort of worry or upset. And they talked about how often, maybe if you're watching something on the news, even if it's the same distressing content or images that's on social media, that would be within a context, and there might be a prelude or some explanation or some warning that you're going to see that as well. And children and young people also reflected on times where perhaps they had seen content that wasn't age appropriate for them, and the impact that that might have on perhaps a younger sibling or someone in their life as well. And I think a really sort of common a recent example of this is again with the murder of Charlie Kirk, where we heard from children and young people, but adults as well, that for many, they didn't seek out this news story. It wasn't something that they wanted to see. They didn't necessarily search for that on their news feed, but it still appeared anyway, just due to kind of the proliferation and how algorithms work with amplifying content as well. Seeing news content on social media can also bring new worries and be overwhelming for children and young people. So 47% of children and young people reported that seeing news content on social media gives them new problems to think about. And examples given by children and young people were perhaps maybe a political situation in a country that didn't relate to them, and they wouldn't have known about if it wasn't for social media, but now that was causing them a level of upset or distress. Children also talked about events in their local area. Maybe there was images circulating of someone carrying a knife, for example, and again, they wouldn't have been aware of that if it hadn't been for that being circulated to them on social media, again, using things like geolocation algorithms. 4 in 10 children and young people also report that they feel overwhelmed by the news content they see on social media. And an example that came up quite a lot in our news research was around the war in Israel and Gaza, and maybe a child might watch one image or one video to feel informed, to get up to speed on the latest that was happening, but then the way the algorithms worked meant that they would then show a number of videos in a row, and that could feel quite overwhelming and cause them uncomfort and distress as well. Children and young people are also concerned about the growth of fake news and AI-generated content on social media. And this is unsurprising when we found in this research that over a quarter of children and young people report that they have seen a fake or AI-generated news story and believed it. And a further 41% say they think they've seen one but aren't sure. And I think this is just sort of obviously quite a difficult question to ask, adults, but children and young people as well. Often you don't know if you've seen an AI-generated news story or a fake news story. That's open to your interpretation. And also, people have different understandings of what, is their truth versus somebody else's truth. So it can be quite a difficult measure to unpick. And children and young people were concerned about the impact that this would have for sort of wider society as well, and the impact that, the spread of mis and disinformation or AI-generated content could have for, disrupting how people thought or what they believe to be true. It also has an individual impact on children and young people as well. So children and young people talked about how when they had seen an AI news story or a fake news story and believed it was true, how that could leave them feeling embarrassed, confused, and at times even less trusting of the news as well. But of course, social media has lots of positives for children and young people, and that is why they are on there and why they are consuming news. It helps them to feel informed. It's often where they hear about breaking news. It can broaden their perspectives. Maybe they're coming across a perspective that they don't have in their offline community, and it also gives them the opportunity to learn and stay informed about global events as well. When it comes to supporting children and young people with navigating this complex and at times upsetting news environment, we found that trusted adults, so parents, teachers, for example, are often who children turn to when they see distressing content on social media. This is sort of unsurprising to us at Internet Matters. We hear this very regularly in our research. Children and young people turn to their parents when they have a negative online experience, and they're also who they learn about sort of online safety from as well. In terms of verifying information, again, we see that there's a really important role to play there for trusted adults. So often, children and young people will talk to a trusted adult like a parent or teacher if they wanted to verify a news story on social media. However, we did see this change a little bit with age. So, for example, younger children were much more likely to turn to a trusted adult, whereas older children were a little bit more likely to verify that news information themselves. And often they would actually turn to social media to do that. So they might check the comments of a post, or they might look to see if that was a verified account, for example. And of course, established news outlets too have a role to play if an established news outlet has posted about a story, for example. Media literacy is central to supporting children to navigate this information environment, and everyone has a slightly different definition of media literacy, which is one of the challenges of working in this space. So for us at Internet Matters, our definition is around being able to evaluate information and distinguish between true and false online, being able to create and share digital content responsibly and safely, and being able to protect oneself from the risks of being online. And this is something that we explored in a report last year called A Vision for Media Literacy. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that, please do see that on our website as well. Parents, again, and carers have a really important role to play in educating children and supporting their media literacy skills. And that includes, verifying news information, supporting children to verify news information they see online and give them the skills to do that themselves as well. And we found that the vast majority of parents and carers are having these conversations already with children and young people, which is excellent to see. However, this is a fast-changing news environment, and parents and carers sometimes don't have the tools themselves. They're navigating this at the same speed as children and young people, and children and young people felt that they sometimes had more knowledge or skills than their parents. So particularly if their parents didn't have a social media account, for example. As well as parents and carers, schools also have an important role to play, schools and teachers, in supporting children's media literacy education. And I'm sure this is something that will come up in our panel discussion, and again has been in the media a little bit this week with the recent curriculum and assessment review final report being published. We think that schools have an excellent kind of position as they are able to reach children and young people at scale. They're a trusted institution in the lives of children and young people, and they're also really excellent means for reaching parents as well. However, unfortunately, we find that media literacy education in the UK is a postcode lottery, and when it comes to teaching children and young people about sort of verifying news information and navigating the online news environment, we found that only 56% of children and young people have had a conversation with a teacher about how to tell if online news is true, and only 20% have had multiple conversations. We also found that children from higher income households were much more likely to have had these conversations with teachers than those from lower income households. And this disparity across schools and also across household income or socioeconomics is something that we see replicated in a lot of our research. Social media companies and established news outlets also have a role to play in supporting children and young people to navigate this news environment. So children and young people had some really excellent ideas around this, whether that is established news outlets or traditional news outlets making content specifically for children and young people that they wanted to engage with and get their news from. The children and young people talked about how content warnings, blurring of images in their newsfeed could also be really positive ways that social media companies could contribute to supporting their well-being when navigating this online environment. And then finally, last thing I just wanted to touch on before we head over to the panel discussion in a moment was some of our recommendations in the report. So our recommendations are grouped into sort of 3 areas. We had recommendations for social media companies, and these really centered on making platforms safe by design. So, that's ensuring, for example, that children were only seeing content that's age appropriate to them. We also made recommendations around media literacy on platforms. So that might be things like having a bit of friction there. So before resharing a post, for example, from an unverified account, suggesting to children, do they want to share that post? We also had recommendations for established news outlets. So, doing similar research to what we've done with children and young people, and then using that to inform the content that they create and what they produce for children and young people. And as always, we had a number of recommendations for government as well. And those are sort of broadly split into 3 areas. We think that more can be done to support children and young people on platforms. We're big proponents of highly effective age assurance and how that can be used to support age-appropriate experiences. I think it's really great. There's been some excellent steps, even since we did this research amongst government, to do more to support media literacy and to have a more coordinated approach across government. So we really support that. And then finally, also supporting schools as well to embed media literacy as part of their curriculum, which again, there were some excellent steps forwards in the curriculum review, but we really need to support sort of teachers with guidance, with resources and training as well. And then just finally, before I hand back to Rachel, we always produce guidance and resources as part of our research or anything that we do. And as part of this research, we produced a number of resources that can be used by parents, teachers and children and young people to learn about how to navigate this information environment. They're all up on our website, and I'm sure someone will drop them in the chat as well. But my favourite one is Find the Fake, which is an online quiz that you can do as a parent or as a teacher with a child, either individually or together. And it's just a fun interactive tool that allows you to guess what information is true or false online. Here you go. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Katie. And I always find it really impactful to hear from young people themselves. So we're really proud that our research kind of brings those voices through. And as we've heard, I think we've got lots of reason for concern about how the change in the way that we all consume news is impacting young people. So as an adult, viewing that type of content we've been talking about, so unverified graphic content, makes me anxious about the world around me. So as a young person, it's easy to see how that immediate and unfiltered version of some of the world's worst aspects of humanity, we talked about some of the examples there, that can be overwhelming, and certainly they've told us that it is. So, and they added to that kind of AI-fueled misinformation, making it harder to know what to believe, but also having the power to kind of influence their views at such a formative age. So I think I probably want to introduce our panellists now. I think it's time we heard from them. So today, alongside Katie, we've got Nicky Cox, MBE, who is Editor-in-Chief of First News, which is the UK's only national newspaper for children, and it has 2.6 million readers. She also founded Children United, a global movement uniting trusted organisations to stand up for every child's right to safely access reliable, age-appropriate news and information. So very pertinent to the discussion today. Then we have Louise, who leads policy on child protection within Ofcom's online safety team. So with over 20 years of regulatory experience, she's delivered Ofcom's key consultations and statements addressing online content which is harmful to children. And then Azzurra, who joined FullFact in January 2024 as policy lead to support engagement with Parliament and focusing on tackling online misinformation and promoting honesty in politics. So we'd love to hear all of your reflections on the findings and what's in our report. So maybe if we start with you, Nicky, kind of what really strikes you from what you've heard this morning?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to take part in this today, and thank you, Internet Matters, for the report, which couldn't be more timely, I think. I mean, over the past 20 years as editor of First News, and 7 years now as editor of FYI, which is Sky News's children's show, I've had a front row seat seeing how children encounter news, how if it's presented poorly, it can really confuse or upset them, which has been in your report. But when it's done well, you know, News for Children can empower them, it can inform them, and it can set them up, you know, for great futures as citizens. As you just kind of referred to, I've just launched a new movement called Children United, which is a lot of organisations, trusted organisations, coming together to create a new, well, the world's first online news channel for children called TVCU, which is launching at the end of this month. So I think I'd love to talk to everybody on here. It's a collaboration of effort, because I think that, you know, we are never going to be able to stop a horse that's already bolted. But what I think we can do is direct children to content that they can trust, and it means everyone working together. As you say, all the content, the platforms, everybody needs to work together, because nothing can be more important, really. And on the media literacy front, First News has got a great new toolkit for schools as well, because that's another thing. I mean, it's kids actually understanding what they're seeing.
Yeah, certainly First News is a big focus in our household with my children. So constantly being given news stories from that. So thank you for all that you're doing in that space. Maybe Louise, we can turn to you and kind of find some of your reflections and kind of think about kind of where Ofcom is in this debate.
Thank you. So as you said, I lead our protection of children policy work. So that comes very much from a harms angle. So what I'm being really interested in is where the Internet Matters research aligns with our own analysis and what we found. So everything that we've done in this space has been underpinned by engagement with the people that are affected. When we published our conclusions, we'd spoken to 27,000 children and 13,000 parents, and those numbers are growing as the implementation rolls out, and we continue to build on that engagement as the regime beds in. So I think this started when we were thinking about the scope of the children's duties and which services we'll expect to take action. We looked at what children do online, and one of those things was go online to get news. So I was pleased to see you referencing our news consumption work. And everything we found there is reflected in our guidance for helping services to understand what their role is and what they need to do in keeping children safe. Like Internet Matters, we also found that children's online experiences vary widely by age and by other characteristics. So I was interested to see your findings about socioeconomic status, for example, and how that can even drive children's experiences of news online. And I think that the big area of overlap, so building up to that, is the role of algorithms. We found that personalised feeds are one of the main ways in which children encounter harmful content. And your research kind of chimes with that and found that the same is true of news. So children can be impacted by content that they don't actually go looking for, whether or not that's harmful. One positive for me coming out of that, though, is that I got the impression that children seem to be developing a better understanding of that and of how their engagement with services will drive the content that they see. So I think that gives us both something to work with to help develop those interventions further to keep children safer online.
Yeah, absolutely. We kind of held an event last month and we spoke to some young people there, and it's amazing kind of how savvy they're becoming to kind of the way that social media is trying to gain their attention, and is that point around, you know, everyone is after that attention. So the way to do that is to be disruptive, but also be kind of quite graphic and shocking to kind of, you know, get people to pause in their feed, and then that kind of drives more of that content. But I think, you know, children are realizing that now and kind of starting to kind of reset a bit so that they don't see as much of this content. But we should actually be supporting them, parents, schools, and the platforms themselves, kind of trying to break that cycle. Azzurra, kind of just turning to you as someone's who's deeply involved probably in the impact of online misinformation in particular. What are your thoughts?
Thanks so much, Rachel. I thought this was such interesting research, and is coming at a moment that is particularly interesting for us who are working in the misinformation landscape. And certainly at FullFact, we've been around for 14 years and have seen a real decline in the misinformation environment. We are seeing misinformation proliferating, in every corner of the internet, and that's really impacted young people more than anything. But I think what really excited me about this research is the moment in which it's coming out. So as many of the audience will know, the government has just announced that they are about to lower the voting age to 16, which means that right now, 11, 12-year-olds will be voting in a couple of years' time. And I think what's so interesting about the research that you've produced is we're starting to see and we're starting to learn, how are these people going to get their information? Where are they looking to? And what can we do as people that care about good information, that care about combating misinformation, to ensure that over the next couple of years, the sources that they're looking at are robust, they're evidence-based, they're filled with good information. So I think what you have done here is so exciting. There's lots of great stuff to talk about and lots of lessons to learn from. But for me, it's coming out at a moment that's so critical in protecting young people and giving them the skills that they're going to need in the next 3, 4, 5 years. So lots of great stuff to talk about here. And thank you so much for having me.
Well, no, thank you all, and we're really delighted to hear your thoughts today. So it's a great panel. So hopefully we'll get some good questions from the audience too. So turning to more specific questions, we've got a few to start with, but please do drop any questions you've got into the Q&A, and we'll try to come to some of those later. I know we've got a few already, which the team are looking at, so we'll weave those in. But when we think about the news environment, we've touched on it a bit there, and interesting what's happened this week as well. So what do you think really are the biggest challenges facing young people in today's landscape, and what happens if we don't address them? So maybe again turning back to you, Nicky, being really involved in getting trusted news out to young people. What do you see that they're grappling with, and how do we work with them and support them?
Well, I suppose the biggest challenge is that they're growing up in a an information Wild West right now. And the problem is that the places that they're spending time on social media, basically, people are just concerned with building numbers and getting views and getting likes and getting followers. And actually, the least important thing to most of these people is it being truthful, and it being accurate, and it being informative, and it being helpful. And that doesn't matter to them. So I think it's really difficult for kids, for adults, when they're basically encountering so much information that's designed to just shock, really, and it's clickbait and it's rage bait at its worst. And traditional trusted news rarely reaches them in the spaces that they are. So I think that's my big concern. And I think it is absolutely imperative on these platforms it's the discoverability. It's making sure that these algorithms don't just, churn up a load of whatever, but actually they prioritize information that actually matters and is truthful and is accurate. And I think that's the most important thing of all. So we're Children United now, this new channel that we're launching, it's going to be everywhere. It will be its own web-based on-demand channel that schools can use safely or families can use safely. But it will also be on YouTube and everything else. And we're working with YouTube and DCMS to try and say, look, YouTube, it's imperative on you to make sure that this stuff surfaces and it comes to the top. So I think, when it was interesting in your report, children saying we're not actively seeking out news, but it just shows up in my feed, but they don't know what's news. They don't know whether it's come from an influencer who's been paid to say that, or do you know what I mean? And it's just really concerning that they're not getting a proper diet of trusted information, and that's imperative on everybody to make sure that changes.
Yeah, well, it sounds like your new initiative is really supporting that and trying to get that trusted news content out there in in the places that children are consuming it. I think that's the challenge, isn't it? It's kind of everything's shifted online, and how we move from that traditional news media that we all consumed when we were kind of younger, and kind of go to the places that children are and create content that is engaging but trustworthy. Maybe kind of turning to you, Louise, on that kind of, challenges for young people and your perspective on that.
I think that the whole environment is challenging, right? So we know, because our evidence shows that children are being exposed to harmful content online. And even though the regulation is now in force, we know we've got a way to go for children to have a safer experience and a more positive, age-appropriate experience. And so we're consulting on additional measures around things like live streaming to keep building up that safety side. But we also want children to really benefit from being online and from content that isn't harmful. And one of the challenges that you and Nicky have drawn out that goes beyond harms is children being able to trust what they see online. So I think that's where Ofcom's media literacy function comes in, and our role there. And my team is working closely with the Making Sense of Media colleagues, making sure that we're working off the same evidence base to develop interventions that can support children from both sides. Back in the online safety space, we've set up a mis and disinformation committee to help us build our understanding and think through some of the challenges from that point of view. I think it's important to recognise that mis and disinformation isn't counted as harmful content under the Act unless it's actually illegal. But I think the insights that we develop here are going to be really important for our media literacy work and our emerging online safety regulation as well.
Thank you. And I think we, in our report, we start to touch on it, but that kind of sense of, what difference AI is making in this landscape, and, kind of that kind of new frontier of technology. And we talk a lot about kind of where that's going, and kind of making sure that kind of regulation kind of keeps pace with that. So maybe kind of coming to you, Azzurra, what's your, how do you think AI is changing or exacerbating these challenges, and, kind of how do we start to address that?
Rachel, that's an enormous question, but
I know.
I can attempt to answer it. I mean, you're spot on, and the research does such a good job of highlighting how tricky it is for young people navigating AI-generated content. And actually, something I thought was really interesting from your report is a lot of young people are saying, I've got this. I can spot AI-generated content, and actually, it's my parents that can't do that. And let me tell you, working for a fact-checking organization, I can tell you they probably can't spot AI-generated content. I mean, we have brilliant fact-checkers with years of experience and excellent technology who are still struggling to determine whether something is true or false. And I think that really, for me, is one of the most alarming things, that actually people are questioning what's fact, what's fiction, and don't have an answer to that. And the technology is moving so quickly that regulation, legislation, I'm going to go as far as to say public understanding, actually can't keep up. So I think what's really tricky about the AI debate is we're having all these discussions, but we're really struggling to understand what is real and what is false. And it's making people question, should I believe this and should I not? We're going to talk a bit about media literacy further on in this panel, but any discussion around AI and people's understanding of whether something is true or false has to be paired with a real change in education, in that we're giving young people critical thinking skills and detection ability to understand what they're looking at and to be more critical when they're engaging with content. So I'm certainly very concerned. I thought the research did a great job of really just highlighting where there are gaps in people's understanding and what more we need to do. And as we start to get to really critical moments, I've talked about the elections that are coming up, but generally with how young people engage with content online, we do need to be looking at AI content as a way to understand where can we go further and what more can we do.
I think it's really worrying that with AI getting so good now, I mean, it used to look very clumsy and very obviously fake, and now it looks so good that I think it's so difficult for anyone to tell sometimes what is AI and what isn't. And I think the biggest concern that I have then about that is that you actually stop trusting anything. And it's like, as an adult, let alone as a child. And I think in the end, if you've got nothing to trust, then where does that leave you? So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a question I just pose about, if you can't trust anything at all, then you've got nothing. So I don't know how we work that one through, but somehow we have to.
Yeah, I think there is so much of it. I mean, I've kind of noticed that in my own feeds. You kind of scroll through things and you think, don't believe any of this, and it's just so much of it out there. And kind of, I suppose it's interesting, this conversation comes in a week where we've had the issues at the BBC, and kind of seen as a the gold standard in terms of trusted news content. And to your point there, Nicky, kind of you get to the point where you don't know what to trust. So kind of what were your thoughts on what would you advise young people when they're faced with questioning someone like the BBC on kind of their bias or the way that they represent kind of people and kind of politically kind of their standpoints? Where do we go?
I mean, that hasn't really helped the debate this week, has
No.
it? When all we say to children is don't believe the stuff you see on TikTok, you need to go to trusted sources like the BBC. So that's not really helped helped that argument. But I suppose what I would say is always, I mean, the usual kind of journalistic and kind of rule is that you check your sources and you check multiple sources. If you see something that doesn't look quite right, wherever it is, just check multiple sources. And the way that you get balance is by not relying on one single outlet. I've got my mother-in-law has read the Daily Express for the last 60 years, and so for her the world is according to the Daily Express, and that's dangerous. And online is the same now. And I think it's just important to just make sure that I would say to adults and to children, just be as well-rounded as you can in where you're getting your information from, and get it from multiple places. And if you see an argument, seek out the counter argument, and make sure that then you're in a position to actually form your own views and opinions.
I might just come in on that as well. Something interesting, which I didn't get a chance to discuss in the research findings, but we did find that children and young people from higher income households, and this is in the report, they were much more likely to get their news from a range of sources. So they were much more likely to get it from social media, but also and different accounts on social media, but also TV, radio, print as well. And they were also more likely to engage with it more frequently, and also to have conversations with those in their lives about it, and have sort of more, maybe not as surface level kind of engagement, but more in-depth engagement with it. And what we did see then when we looked at kind of identifying fake news and confidence around media literacy and what they might do if they were to verify information, they had more tools at their disposal to do that. So I think, sort of echoing Nicky's point around having kind of lots of different touch points and not relying on one way of verifying information, or one kind of conversation or point in the cog. And I think that also brings me on to another point I was thinking about. Parents and teachers have an important role to play, but gosh, that is like quite a heavy burden to put on them when it is a fast changing environment, and we're kind of navigating that at the same pace. And I think again that underscores pulling in other, whether it's trusted news outlets, whether it's resources available on sites like Internet Matters, whether it's having a conversation about the work of FullFact. I think it's those continual reinforcements from a range of different sources that can be really positive as part of this as well.
Maybe we can move on to kind of talking a bit about that kind of media literacy question now. I think you kind of started that conversation there, Katie, and we've heard a lot in the last week about the government's kind of plans for the curriculum, and you alluded to that earlier, kind of Azzurra, and thinking about school is a place that all children go to and they all go there to learn. So kind of what should schools and what should the government be kind of mandating in schools in terms of that kind of media literacy and critical thinking skills? Maybe you can elaborate on your thoughts around that, Azzurra.
Thanks. It's, as you say, a really exciting and I go so far as say groundbreaking week in terms of this media literacy world. And there'll be many in the audience and on this call as well who are really excited at the prospect of what's coming. So those of you who aren't aware, we have just had the final report of the curriculum and assessment review, and those of us working in this space have been campaigning for many years to have media literacy embedded within the curriculum. So to have it taught within schools, because as Katie says, the schools are the place where young people are reached. So this is the perfect place to start talking to young people about what skills might they need. Now, at FullFact, we have of course been calling for people to be taught about misinformation. What does it mean? How do you counter it? How do you look for good sources? And actually, the review has come out really positively and said that is something that they want to do. It's going to take many years to do, because to redesign a whole curriculum is an enormous task. But actually, this week saw some real changes in that environment. That being said, designing a curriculum is, as I said, lengthy and messy and complicated. And there's a lot more still to come in terms of refining the detail of what does that actually look like in practice? Because as Louise said, misinformation is a complicated word. It's complicated to regulate. It's complicated to identify. So how does that work in practice? But we are certainly really keen to see the curriculum review say, yes, media literacy is very important, and for the government to stand by that and say, we agree. We want people to be taught about fake news. We want people to be taught about good sources, and that needs to start from early ages of school all the way up until young people graduate. Alongside that, I mean, we're talking about schools, but we do need to talk about parents too, and how can teachers be supported in this, as we say, very ever-changing environment? What more can they do, and how can they be supported to know how to talk to young people about this? So we're very excited, I'm sure as many others are as well, and are looking, to work with the government on what does this look in practice, and how can this be done in a way that best protects young people for many, many years to come.
Mm-hmm. I know we've been really excited about the curriculum review. Katie, have you got anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, we echo that excitement, and I think for us it was great to see many of the recommendations from our vision for media literacy, which really deep dived into how media literacy education in schools echoed in the curriculum review's findings, and then also in the government response to that. So embedding citizenship from the start of primary school, expanding the computing curriculum to teach about AI, and not just kind of how to use AI effectively, but also the pros and cons of that. I think all of that will go a significant way to supporting children and young people. But yes, curriculum will not be amended until 2028. So there is a bit of a gap to fill in that time. And I think a few sort of concerns or areas that we hope that, the sector will be able to come together and support around is supporting schools and teachers to implement those changes effectively. So, schools need clear guidance on what to teach, where, what are the kind of key terminologies. Often teachers we find don't maybe have the confidence to teach about some of these topics. Again, there's some great work being done by the Peers Foundation and Public First, looking at conspiracy theories and how we teach about conspiracy theories in school. And, often teachers can be unconfident teaching about that because, it's really hard to disagree with someone or to present a view without, if you don't know that kind of topic inside out yourself as well. So we need to also support teachers with resources and training to be able to teach about these difficult topics. And I think that's kind of the next bit of this, is now we have sort of some agreement to doing this, but how do we implement it effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of maybe turning to you now, Louise, kind of thinking about that, Katie's talked there about the gap between writing up the new curriculum and implementing it. So, beyond schools, what other action, is really needed to support children with some of the challenges we've been discussing and navigating that kind of quite difficult media environment?
I mean, I think this is really important, because regulation is just one part of the picture alongside schools. I think one thing I might pull out a bit more is the role of parents in this. Our engagement with parents shows that they're really key to supporting children online, and your research also reflects this. So I think you alluded to this, Katie. We should be thinking about supporting parents as well, supporting parents to support their children. And I think we all have a role in this, in Ofcom and anybody responding to the curriculum review as well. Just making sure that parents are a part of that ongoing debate.
Yeah, so I think Internet Matters is here to support parents. I think Katie's already alluded to some of our resources, but we've also talked about the fact that it's difficult for us as adults, as parents, to know what's fact, what's fiction online, and kind of identify misinformation and fake news. So I think parents need to be supported as much as young people in that. And we've developed lots of resources, but they're parents are the front line. So they're often the first place that children go to when they see something that it makes them uncomfortable or doesn't feel right online. So they need to understand that landscape as much as much as the young people. So I think that's an ongoing challenge. And as Katie said, that's different children have different experiences depending on their own parents, tech savviness or kind of exposure to that type of content. If they don't have a social media account, it's difficult for them to potentially participate in those conversations. Just kind of conscious of time and kind of turning to maybe some of our audience questions that kind of lead into maybe more of a conversation around kind of what social media platforms should be doing. So we've someone's kind of put in a question around, they've heard from children that kind of the news sections on the social media platforms they use are often featuring kind of tabloid style content, inappropriate, sometimes pornographic material, often about influencers or performers. They've asked, did our research uncover anything related to this, particularly insights that could help organisations working with children and just to understand their exposure to such content. So maybe we'll start with that one, and then it kind of goes on to a question about regulation. So maybe Katie, was there anything in the research that could shine a bit more of a light on that?
Yeah, so I think there was a couple of things that just come to mind, and I'm just trying to recall them off the top of my head. So one of them was around, particularly, I think it was Snapchat and that tabloid content, and then they said that often they would click into that news story and it would have nothing to do with that headline. So, but they would often sort of get filled or maybe have already reshared it. So I think there's something there around teaching children and young people. I mean, I think that's something that also happens with, traditional news outlets, depending on who you're getting the information from. But there's definitely sort of media literacy skills around how that, I guess, looks and feels on platforms as well, and how kind of clickbait or the monetization of platforms can influence sort of what's being said in those headlines, and the need to drill down and think before sharing that onto other news outlets. In terms of sort of inappropriate content, so I don't think we had any examples of sort of pornographic content, but we did do some research on chatbots earlier this year, and children, young people were exposed to sort of age inappropriate content on those. And obviously some children, young people may be using them to access news information. And so that also creates, I think, a new dilemma. But children, young people did talk a lot about violent content. So that was something that they would often see, images of children, young people with knives, and then sort of a voiceover perhaps of what was happening in a particular community. So definitely is content that would be considered age inappropriate and probably wouldn't also might come into regulation with the Online Safety Act, though. Since we have an expert on the call, I won't dive into that.
Yes, I suppose the second part of that question was what regulation should we be expecting and fighting for when it comes to online tabloid content when it's framed as educational use. That was kind of a question from the audience, but I suppose kind of thinking about the responsibilities of social media platform in terms of children's experiences of news online. Maybe kind of Louise, you can answer a bit more when we get into that space.
Sure. I mean, picking up on the particular two types that were mentioned in the question. So platforms have had a responsibility since July to keep children safe from harmful content. They should be preventing children from encountering pornography at all. There are slightly different rules around violent content, where I think it's the most obvious overlap between news and the safety regime. That's where the two can intersect. So platforms should also be keeping children safe from violent content, either by preventing them from seeing it, or taking it down in down ranking it in feeds, or equally up ranking positive content to counterbalance it and make sure that children are less likely to encounter this harmful content. So I think that's the main thing we want platforms to engage with. They also need to know who children are to deliver all this, which is why I work on age assurance is really important here. But I'd just like to zoom out for a bit and just recognise that platforms shouldn't be restricting children's access to non-harmful content, because we want children to have more positive, more age appropriate experiences online overall. I'd just mention in this context that we've got the Online Safety Act recognises the importance of news content and journalistic content, and there are some additional protections for those kinds of content. So we'll be consulting on those next year. I'd encourage services to engage with that as well.
Thanks. It is a kind of never-ending battle, isn't it? And yeah, thank you all for all your kind of contribution here. Does anyone else kind of want to come in on that final question, maybe before we start to wrap up?
Just maybe to say, one of the recommendations that you make in your report that I'm really supportive of and FullFact has been also a big fan of is around the friction measures that you have suggested within media literacy. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of some of those things. So certainly as fact checkers, we have a similar friction method where if we deem something to be false or misleading, we're able to put a sort of a warning label on that content. And we have found that to be really effective. And there's really interesting research to show it is effective. And I think you have made a great claim to say, why can't this be done, within platform design? Why can't platforms go further to ensure that young people are protected from some of these things? So really supportive of that. And I think that's something we should be pushing for and talking to all the right people about, because it seems certainly very sensible.
Oh, I think you're talking, Nicky, but you're still on mute.
Sorry, I was just, by the way, my Wi-Fi went down about 10 minutes ago, so I hope I didn't kind of suddenly look a bit gormless or disappear for 5 minutes and miss some of the conversation. But no, I was just going to say I agree. I mean, in entertainment, we have age ratings and parental controls, and it feels like we should be able to do the same for kind of news and information, that there should be some kind of nutritional label for content that does you good.
Absolutely. So kind of 5 minutes to go. So just probably wanted to kind of final kind of wrap up from each of you, and maybe there's a if you could kind of limit it to a kind of short soundbite, but kind of if there's one kind of practical action you'd like to see from kind of whether that's policymakers, tech companies, civil society, or kind of indeed the news industry to support young people, what would it be? Maybe we'll start with you, Nicky.
Well, I think I said it earlier, right now the loudest, most emotional voices are the ones that dominate online and seem to have the megaphones. And we need what we just said, the digital equivalent of a nutritional label for information, I think, so that tech companies prioritize content from trusted sources, and their algorithms and policymakers recognize the access to truth as a fundamental children's right. And also, as I said earlier, First News have got a media literacy toolkit now for schools, because we've got a few years until it becomes part of the curriculum, but teachers need to know how to teach it. And I think, it's again incumbent on all of us to help them do that. Poor teachers.
Yes. Got a big job. Louise, maybe you can go next.
I think the obvious answer, I'd like to see media literacy become embedded in education in the same way that online safety has over the time that my children have been at school. And that's, speaking as a parent, but also I think our stakeholders and the other speakers on this call recognise that, that's a view that many of them share. The curriculum review is a great start, but as we've been saying, I think we've all got a role in actually making that happen and supporting teachers, children, parents in making it embedded in that way.
Maybe you, Azzurra.
I suppose my call to action is for a bit more urgency on this issue, that we are all talking about really important measures, but they're going to take years to implement. And to be frank, we don't have years in this crisis. We need to do something far more urgently than a curriculum that's going to come in 3, 4, 5 years time. So my sort of parting wish and desire is that policymakers, platforms, government, regulators start to take some urgent action to ensure that young people are protected now and not just in a couple of years' time.
Thank you. And finally, Katie.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I think there's some really great steps going on, curriculum and assessment review, some of the actions around media literacy and coordination, and the government's response to the House of Lords inquiry into media literacy are really positive. Obviously, the Online Safety Act is going to go some way to using regulation to improve kind of the social media diets and news information of children. But I think coming back to parents, obviously, we know they have that important role, and tapped away in the government's response to the media literacy review was a thing around supporting parents, sort of a hub of resources for parents, or maybe some sort of, I think it would be great to have like maybe a public campaign or something that helps parents and trusted adults. And I think that's something maybe a little bit more immediate that we could work to.
Thanks, everyone. So it's been a really great conversation today. So thank you all for your input and for kind of joining us. Kind of really delighted you could all kind of take part in that conversation. So we've heard a lot about kind of the importance of young people and kind of engaging in world affairs, and we absolutely want them to do that. But, you know, as Azzurra alluded to, with kind of the voting age being reduced, you know, we need to make sure that the platforms they use to do that are kind of designed responsibly. We talk about some of the actions that can be taken around better content labelling, you know, algorithms that don't prioritise sharing of misleading or false stories, and kind of are sensitive to different levels of maturity, and that those platforms do kind of mandate good kind of age, or kind of apply good kind of age assurance. Also around schools, so kind of giving and supporting young people to gain the critical thinking digital skills they need, and you know, all kind of hope that the curriculum review will kind of deliver good measures and embed media literacy, as we've said. So it's, you know, undeniable now that's needed to kind of child of every age, and to be available to all children regardless of where they live or what school they go to, because, you know, if we saw in the report, that can be a postcode lottery. And kind of, you know, we wouldn't be Internet Matters if we didn't say kind of finally, kind of, you know, as with the majority of the online safety issues and media literacy that affect children, it's kind of parents and carers on the front line who have to deal with those issues and the upset that can cause. So they need to be able to find the guidance and support. They need to navigate what's happening with news, you know, for themselves as much as for their children. And kind of Internet Matters will continue to champion that and provide resources that will help parents. So thank you everyone for attending today, and I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation, and the research has helped shine a light on children's experience of online news and the challenges we all face moving forward. Finally, huge thank you to our internal team for a brilliant report as ever, and a great webinar today, and to all of our speakers and panellists. So Katie, thank you. Nicky, Louise and Azzurra, thanks for joining us, and really welcome your contributions and reflections today. So thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.